"Ma'am, if you can't afford the room, stop wasting everyone's time." The words sliced through the grand lobby so sharply that even the soft piano music seemed to hesitate. Conversations faded. Heads turned. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers hanging 3 stories above, while a dozen travelers standing near the reception area suddenly found something more interesting than their phones. Behind the front desk, Ethan Collins straightened his navy suit jacket and folded his arms. At 31 years old, he had built a reputation for spotting trouble before it reached the hotel's guests, or at least that was what he liked to tell himself. Standing across from him was a small, elderly black woman holding the handle of a worn brown suitcase. The suitcase looked older than some of the hotel employees. Its corners were faded, and one of the brass clasps had lost its shine decades ago. The woman's coat was simple. Rainwater still glistened on the fabric from the drizzle outside. Her silver hair rested neatly beneath a knitted hat. Nothing about her appearance matched the luxury surrounding her. The hotel's towering glass entrance, imported Italian stone, and 5-star reputation seemed to belong to another world entirely. Yet the woman didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her weathered hands resting lightly on the suitcase handle. "I have a reservation," she said quietly. Her voice carried no anger, no embarrassment, just certainty. Ethan forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm sure you think you do." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman near the elevators lowered his newspaper. A young couple waiting to check in stopped whispering. The atmosphere had shifted. Everyone could feel it. The elderly woman reached into her purse and carefully removed a printed confirmation email. The paper had been folded and unfolded many times. She slid it across the counter. Ethan barely looked at it. Instead, his eyes moved back to the suitcase, then to her coat, then to her shoes. Old shoes. Practical shoes. The kind made for comfort rather than appearances. In his mind, the judgment was already complete. "Ma'am," he said, tapping the counter with one finger, "this hotel charges more for one night than most people spend in a month." A nervous chuckle came from somewhere behind the line. The woman's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough to reveal a flicker of pain beneath her calm expression. "I understand that," she replied. Ethan leaned forward. "Then maybe there's been some mistake." Outside, rain tapped softly against the towering windows. Inside, the chandeliers continued to cast warm golden light across the marble floor. The contrast felt strange. Everything in the lobby was designed to make people feel welcome. Yet one person stood completely alone. The elderly woman glanced briefly toward the entrance, as if gathering herself. Then she looked back at Ethan. "Could you please check the reservation?" she asked. Ethan sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. And what name would that be? Margaret Hayes. The name seemed to mean nothing to him. He typed lazily into the computer. A few seconds passed. Then his expression changed for the briefest moment before quickly returning to annoyance. Something had appeared on the screen. Something real. Something unexpected. But instead of acknowledging it, Ethan closed the reservation window. "I'm sorry," he said coldly. "I can't help you." A hush settled over the lobby. Margaret looked at him for several long seconds. The rain continued falling outside. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the city skyline. And although no one in that lobby knew it yet, the small wooden box resting quietly inside Margaret Hayes' old suitcase carried a story that was about to change everything. Margaret Hayes did not move right away. The paper reservation remained on the counter between her and Ethan Collins like a bridge neither of them intended to cross. Around her, the lobby slowly came back to life. Guests resumed conversations. Suitcases rolled across polished stone. A bellman pushed a brass luggage cart toward the elevators. Yet something still lingered in the air. A feeling that what had just happened was not finished. Margaret carefully picked up the confirmation page and folded it along the same creases that had already softened with age. Her hands were steady. They had spent 4 decades writing lesson plans, grading papers, comforting nervous students, and turning pages of books in quiet classrooms. One unpleasant encounter was not enough to shake them. She slipped the paper back into her purse and rested her hand on the worn suitcase. Ethan was already looking past her toward the next guest in line. As far as he was concerned, the situation was over. Margaret offered a small nod, not to him, but to herself. Then she turned, and began walking toward the entrance. Rain streaked down the enormous glass windows overlooking the city. Outside, traffic lights reflected red and gold across wet pavement. A cold breeze greeted her the moment the revolving door carried her back onto the sidewalk. She stopped beneath the covered entrance and looked across the street. Taxis passed. People hurried beneath umbrellas. New York moved forward without noticing her at all. For a few seconds, she simply stood there listening to the rain. Then she knelt beside the old suitcase. The brass clasp clicked softly as she opened it. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a framed photograph, and a small wooden box no larger than a hardcover novel. The wood was dark with age. Tiny scratches marked the surface. Margaret brushed her fingers across the lid almost affectionately. Her reflection appeared faintly in the rain-speckled glass behind her. Older now. More wrinkles. More gray hair. But the same eyes. The same determination. She opened the box. Bundles of yellowed letters rested inside, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a black and white photograph from decades earlier. A young woman smiled at the camera. Beside her stood a tall man wearing a simple suit. Margaret stared at the picture for a moment longer than she intended. The memory returned with surprising clarity. Summer sunlight. Laughter. A promise made long ago. Her throat tightened slightly. Not from sadness. From responsibility. She had carried that promise for more than 50 years. The hotel behind her was not merely a destination. It was the final stop on a journey she had postponed for far too long. A gust of wind swept beneath the awning. Margaret carefully closed the box and returned it to the suitcase. As she rose to her feet, a black luxury sedan pulled up near the curb. The rear door opened, and a woman stepped out. She appeared to be in her early 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal coat despite the weather. Employees immediately rushed toward the entrance. Their posture changed the moment they saw her. Respect, urgency, recognition. Margaret noticed none of that at first. She was focused on securing the suitcase clasp. But as the woman passed by, her eyes briefly landed on the wooden box still visible inside the luggage. She stopped. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that she had seen something impossible. Something she had not expected to encounter on a rainy afternoon in New York City. The woman remained still for several seconds, allowing the rain to fall around her as employees hurried past. Margaret noticed the change in the stranger's expression immediately. It was the kind of look people wore when they recognized a face from an old photograph or heard a song they had not thought about in years. The woman stepped closer. Her eyes never left the wooden box. "Excuse me," she said softly. "May I ask where you got that?" Margaret glanced down at the box before looking back up. "It has belonged to me for a very long time." The woman nodded slowly. Her posture, confident and composed only moments earlier, seemed suddenly uncertain. "Could I see it?" she asked. Margaret hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she had protected its contents for more than half a century. Rain tapped steadily against the awning overhead. Across the street, headlights reflected across the wet pavement like liquid gold. Finally, Margaret opened the suitcase once more and carefully lifted the box into her hands. The woman inhaled sharply the moment she saw the faded engraving on the lid. Her fingers rose toward it before stopping midway, as though touching it might make the moment disappear. "That cannot be possible," she whispered. Margaret studied her face. There was familiarity there now. Not recognition exactly, but connection. A thread stretching backward through decades neither of them could yet see clearly. "Do we know each other?" Margaret asked. The woman looked up. "My name is Victoria Sterling." The name meant little to Margaret at first. Then she noticed the hotel employees watching from nearby. The doorman standing straighter than before. The manager hurrying toward the entrance. The way people instinctively stepped aside when Victoria moved. This was not an ordinary guest. "You own the hotel," Margaret said quietly. Victoria offered a small nod. "My family does." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Victoria pointed gently toward the box. "The engraving. My father used to draw that symbol on everything he owned." Margaret looked down. The carving was worn from age, but still visible. A small compass surrounded by laurel leaves. Her heart skipped unexpectedly. She had not heard anyone mention that symbol in decades. Victoria seemed equally unsettled. "Where did you get it?" she asked again. Margaret slowly opened the lid. Inside, the bundles of letters rested exactly where she had left them. The blue ribbon had faded almost gray. Beneath the letters lay the old photograph. Victoria's eyes widened the instant she saw it. Her hand covered her mouth. "That is him," she breathed. "That is my father." The city noise seemed to fade into the distance. Margaret looked at the photograph, then back at Victoria. The young man smiling beside her in the picture no longer resembled the powerful businessman whose face had once appeared in magazines and newspaper headlines. Yet the resemblance was unmistakable. Victoria swallowed hard. "I have seen that photograph before." Margaret felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. For years, she had wondered whether anyone else remembered those days. Whether anyone still cared about promises made long ago. Now a woman standing in the rain outside a luxury hotel was staring at a forgotten photograph as though it were a treasure map. Behind the glass entrance, Ethan Collins happened to glance outside. He saw Victoria Sterling speaking with the elderly woman he had just dismissed. His confident expression faded. Something about the scene felt wrong. Very wrong. And as Victoria carefully lifted one of the old letters from the box, Ethan felt the first quiet stirrings of concern settle into his stomach. Victoria held the letter with extraordinary care, as though the fragile paper carried far more than words. Rain whispered against the awning overhead while the city moved around them, unaware that two lives separated by decades had just collided. Margaret watched as Victoria unfolded the yellowed page. The handwriting was unmistakably elegant, written in dark blue ink that had softened with age. Victoria read the first few lines silently. Then her eyes widened. She looked down again, reading more slowly this time. Her composure began to crack. Not dramatically, just enough for Margaret to notice. The hotel owner drew a careful breath. "This is his handwriting," she said quietly. "I would know it anywhere." Margaret nodded. "Your father wrote that letter 52 years ago." Victoria stared at her. "You knew him?" It was not a question anymore. Margaret glanced toward the photograph inside the box. A faint smile touched her face. Long before anyone called him a hotel magnate, the wind carried the scent of rain and wet concrete through the entrance. Behind the glass doors, several employees had stopped pretending not to watch. The hotel manager now stood near the reception desk, speaking urgently into a phone. Ethan Collins remained frozen behind the counter. He could not hear the conversation outside, but he could see enough to understand one thing. The woman he had dismissed was receiving the full attention of the most important person connected to the property. Victoria carefully turned the letter over. A second sheet slipped free. Then another. Dozens of pages rested inside the box. Decades of correspondence preserved like pieces of history. "My father searched for you," Victoria said. "For years." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I know. Then why did you never contact him?" For a moment, only the rain answered. Margaret folded her hands over the handle of her suitcase. The wrinkles on her fingers caught the soft afternoon light. "Because some promises are not about being remembered." Victoria looked at her silently. Margaret continued. "Back then, your father was a young man trying to build something meaningful. I helped him once when he needed it. That was enough." Victoria shook her head slowly. "Not to him." She reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone. After a brief search, she opened an image. It showed an old framed newspaper article hanging on a wall. The photograph featured a younger version of her father standing beside the first Sterling Hotel. Beneath the image was a quote. Victoria turned the screen toward Margaret. The words made her breath catch. "For more than 50 years I have dedicated every success to a teacher who showed me kindness when the world offered none. If I ever find Margaret Hayes again, I will finally be able to thank her." Margaret stared at the screen. Her eyes glistened. Not from the rain. From memory. Across the lobby, Ethan suddenly noticed the manager marching directly toward him. The manager's face looked unusually pale. "Did you speak to the woman outside?" he asked. Ethan swallowed. "Yes." "Did you refuse her reservation?" Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "I thought there was an issue." The manager closed his eyes briefly. "There is an issue," he said. "A very serious one." Outside, Victoria carefully returned the letters to the wooden box. Then she looked at Margaret with unmistakable respect. "You are not standing out here another minute," she said. "Please come inside." Margaret glanced toward the enormous glass doors where Ethan stood watching. Neither woman said anything further. Yet the moment felt strangely inevitable, as if a story that had been waiting half a century had finally reached the page where everything was about to change. The warmth of the lobby felt different when Margaret stepped back inside. A few minutes earlier, she had stood there alone, judged before anyone knew her name. Now every eye seemed drawn toward her. The revolving door turned slowly behind them, carrying in a brief gust of cool air before settling once again into silence. Victoria Sterling walked beside her, one hand resting lightly on the wooden box. The gesture was small, but everyone noticed it. The owner of one of the most prestigious hotels in New York was treating the elderly woman with the kind of respect usually reserved for heads of state and longtime friends. Near the reception desk, Ethan Collins felt his pulse quicken. The manager stood beside him with a rigid expression. Neither man spoke. They simply watched as Victoria approached. The marble floor reflected the chandelier light like still water. Every footstep echoed softly through the enormous lobby. Margaret remained composed. She did not look around for validation. She did not carry herself differently now that people were paying attention. She walked with the same quiet dignity she had possessed when she first entered the building. Victoria stopped directly in front of the reception desk. Her eyes settled on Ethan. "Is this the employee who handled Mrs. Hayes's reservation?" she asked. The manager cleared his throat. "Yes." Ethan swallowed. "Miss Sterling, I can explain." Victoria did not raise her voice. In some ways, that made the moment more uncomfortable. "Then explain why a confirmed guest was turned away." Ethan searched for an answer. The computer screen glowed faintly beside him. The reservation still existed exactly where it had always been. There had never been a mistake. Never been a problem with the booking. Only assumptions. The realization seemed heavier now than it had moments earlier. "I thought there was confusion," he said weakly. Victoria glanced toward the screen. "Did you verify the reservation?" Ethan hesitated. That hesitation answered the question better than words ever could. Around them, the lobby had fallen silent again. Guests who had been checking messages or waiting for elevators now listened openly. Margaret stood quietly beside her suitcase. She offered no criticism, no anger, no satisfaction. Her calm presence somehow made Ethan feel even smaller. Victoria turned toward the manager. "Prepare the presidential suite." The manager blinked. Immediately, several employees hurried away at once. Ethan stared in disbelief. The presidential suite occupied the top floor and was reserved for distinguished guests and international dignitaries. Victoria then faced Margaret. "It would be an honor if you stayed as our guest." Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "That is very kind, but it is not necessary." Victoria smiled softly. "For my family, it is." The words lingered in the air. "For my family." Ethan felt them settle heavily in his chest. The story hidden inside that wooden box was clearly larger than he had imagined. Much larger. Victoria carefully removed another letter from the collection. "There is something else you should know," she said. "A few months before my father passed away, he left instructions regarding you." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. The manager looked confused. Ethan looked terrified. Victoria unfolded the letter and glanced down at the faded handwriting. Then she looked back at Margaret. "He believed you would come here someday." The lobby became perfectly still. Even the distant sound of luggage wheels seemed to disappear. Victoria held the letter carefully between her fingers. "And he left something behind for the day you arrived." For several seconds, nobody moved. The letter remained in Victoria Sterling's hands while the silence settled over the lobby like a soft blanket. Outside, the rain continued to drift across the city streets, turning the evening lights into blurred ribbons of gold and amber. Margaret Hayes stood beside her old suitcase, her fingers resting gently on the worn handle. She felt suddenly aware of every year that had passed since she had last seen the man whose handwriting now waited to speak again. Victoria unfolded the final page with extraordinary care. The paper crackled softly in the quiet room. Then she began to read. "If you are hearing these words, then Margaret Hayes has finally come home." A visible shiver passed through Margaret's shoulders. Victoria paused before continuing. "There are many accomplishments people have credited me for during my lifetime. They have praised my business decisions, my hotels, and my success. Yet none of those things would exist without the kindness of one woman." The lobby remained completely silent. Employees stood motionless. Guests listened openly. Even Ethan Collins seemed unable to breathe normally. Victoria continued reading. "More than 50 years ago, when I was young, uncertain, and nearly ready to abandon my dream, Margaret Hayes treated me with a dignity I had not experienced in a very long time. She expected nothing in return. She simply chose kindness when kindness was not easy. Margaret lowered her eyes. The chandelier light reflected faintly in the moisture gathering along her lashes. Victoria's voice softened. For decades I searched for her. Not because I owed her money or success. I searched because gratitude should never remain unfinished. A deep stillness settled over the room. The words seemed to fill every corner of the vast hotel. Victoria reached the final paragraph. Her own voice trembled slightly now. If Margaret ever arrives at one of my hotels, she is to be welcomed as family. She is to receive every courtesy we can provide. Most importantly, she is to know that the life she helped shape became everything she hoped it could be. Victoria slowly lowered the letter. Neither woman spoke immediately. They simply stood facing each other while decades of memory passed silently between them. Then Victoria reached into her coat pocket and removed a small brass key attached to a dark blue ribbon. The metal gleamed beneath the chandelier light. My father left this with the letter, she said quietly. He instructed me to give it to you. Margaret looked puzzled. Victoria smiled gently. It opens a private display room on the top floor. My father created it years ago. He called it the Room of First Beginnings. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly. Victoria's smile grew warmer. Every photograph, every early business plan, every handwritten note from the beginning of his journey is preserved there. She paused, and at the center of that room is a plaque bearing a single name. Margaret's fingers trembled as she accepted the key. Around them, dozens of people watched. Ethan felt a heaviness settle into his chest unlike anything he had experienced before. He had looked at an elderly woman and seen only an old suitcase. He had looked at a simple coat and seen only appearances. Yet standing before him was someone whose quiet kindness had shaped an entire legacy. And for the first time that day, the weight of that mistake became impossible to ignore. Victoria led Margaret toward a private elevator hidden behind a polished walnut wall near the rear of the lobby. The crowd slowly parted to make room for them. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft hum of the elevator doors opening and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. Margaret stepped inside, carrying the wooden box against her chest. Victoria followed. As the doors closed, the noise of the lobby disappeared. For the first time all afternoon, they were alone. The elevator rose smoothly. Floor numbers glowed one after another. Margaret watched them climb while memories surfaced like old photographs floating to the surface of water. She remembered a young man sitting at a diner counter with a notebook full of impossible dreams. She remembered encouraging him when few others did. She remembered telling him that success was not measured by wealth, but by how many people felt welcome when they walked through your door. Back then, neither of them could have imagined a hotel like this. The elevator finally stopped at the highest floor. When the doors opened, a quiet hallway stretched before them. Warm lights illuminated framed photographs covering the walls. Some showed construction crews. Others showed ribbon cuttings and grand openings from decades past. Victoria led Margaret to a single oak door at the end of the corridor. The brass key fit perfectly into the lock. A gentle click echoed through the stillness. Margaret pushed the door open. Her breath caught instantly. The room was larger than she expected. Glass display cases lined the walls. Early sketches of the first hotel hung in elegant frames. Business plans sat preserved beneath protective glass. Newspaper articles documented the rise of the Sterling brand from a modest dream into an international name. Yet none of that captured Margaret's attention. Her eyes were drawn to the center of the room. There, illuminated beneath a soft spotlight, stood a bronze plaque mounted on polished stone. Victoria remained silent as Margaret slowly approached. Every step felt heavier than the last. The room seemed to narrow around her. Finally, she reached the plaque. Her fingers trembled. Engraved into the bronze were words she never expected to see. In honor of Margaret Hayes, the first person who believed when there was nothing yet to believe in. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment, she could not speak. The years seemed to dissolve. The losses, the distance, the long silence. All of it faded beneath the simple realization that kindness had been remembered. Behind her, Victoria quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. He came here often, she said softly, especially during his final years. Margaret turned toward her. Victoria smiled through the emotion in her voice. He would sit in this room for hours. Sometimes he talked about business. Sometimes he talked about family, but he always talked about you. Downstairs, Ethan Collins stood motionless behind the reception desk. The manager had already assigned another employee to cover his station. Yet Ethan had not left. He could not. The image of Margaret standing alone with her suitcase replayed again and again in his mind. For the first time in a very long time, he was beginning to understand that the most important things about a person could never be seen from across a counter. Margaret remained in the room of first beginnings long after the emotions had settled into a quiet warmth. She moved slowly from display to display, studying photographs she had never seen and reading notes she never knew had been preserved. In one frame, she found a copy of a letter she had written decades earlier. The paper was faded, but the message remained simple. Believe in people before they believe in themselves. She smiled softly. Victoria stood nearby, giving her space while sharing stories about her father's life. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. Eventually, they returned to the lobby together. The atmosphere felt different now. Evening had settled over the city. The rain had stopped. Beyond the glass entrance, reflections from passing cars shimmered across the wet streets. Employees moved quietly through their duties. Guests chatted near the fireplace lounge. Yet the moment Margaret entered, several staff members straightened instinctively. Respect had replaced curiosity. Near the reception desk, Ethan Collins waited alone. His uniform was still perfectly pressed, but his confidence had disappeared. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say a dozen times and discarded every version. None of them felt sufficient. As Margaret approached, he stepped forward. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him. Victoria stopped a few feet away, watching silently. Ethan lowered his eyes. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked at him calmly. Ethan drew a breath. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I saw your suitcase. I saw your clothes. I made assumptions that had no place in this hotel or anywhere else." The lobby seemed to grow still once again. Ethan continued, "You deserved respect the moment you walked through those doors. I failed to give it to you." His voice carried genuine regret now. Not fear. Not self-protection. Regret. Margaret studied him for a moment. The young man standing before her no longer looked arrogant. He looked human. Flawed. Embarrassed. Trying to do better. She thought about the students she had taught over the years. Thousands of young faces. Some confident. Some uncertain. All capable of making mistakes and learning from them. Finally, she smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that." Ethan looked up, surprised by the kindness in her voice. Margaret rested one hand lightly on her suitcase. "The truth is, every person you meet carries a story you cannot see." Ethan nodded slowly. "I understand that now." Margaret's smile widened. "Then something good can still come from today." The tension seemed to leave his shoulders all at once. Victoria watched the exchange quietly. She had expected forgiveness, because that was who Margaret Hayes had always been according to her father. Still, seeing it firsthand felt different. More powerful. Ethan glanced toward the wooden box resting beside Margaret. "Your kindness changed my employer's life decades ago," he said. "And somehow you are still teaching people." Margaret laughed softly. The sound was warm and genuine. Old. Teachers never really retire. Around them, several employees smiled. The heavy atmosphere that had followed the afternoon's events finally began to lift. For the first time since Margaret arrived, the hotel felt exactly as its founder had always intended it to feel. Not defined by status. Not defined by appearances. Defined by welcome. Later that night, the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential suite. The rain had long since passed. The streets below shimmered beneath thousands of reflections, and the distant glow of Manhattan painted the sky in shades of silver and gold. Margaret Hayes stood quietly near the window, holding a cup of tea. The wooden box rested on a nearby table beside the letters she had protected for more than half a century. For the first time in many years, she felt something she had not expected to feel again. Peace. Not because she had been recognized. Not because her name appeared on a plaque. But because an unfinished chapter had finally reached its ending. Earlier that evening, Victoria had arranged a private dinner in one of the hotel's smaller dining rooms. No reporters. No photographers. No publicity. Just conversation. They spoke for hours about family, memories, and the man who had connected their lives across generations. Victoria shared stories Margaret had never heard. Margaret shared stories Victoria had never known. By the end of the night, they no longer felt like strangers. They felt like family linked by gratitude rather than blood. Downstairs, Ethan Collins remained at work long after his shift should have ended. The lobby was nearly empty now. A few travelers crossed the marble floor while the cleaning staff moved quietly through the hallways. Ethan found himself standing in front of a framed mission statement mounted near the concierge desk. He had passed it hundreds of times without truly reading it. Tonight was different. The final line caught his attention. Every guest deserves dignity before they deserve service. He stared at the words for a long time. Then he smiled faintly. Not because he felt proud of himself. Quite the opposite. He smiled because he finally understood what those words meant. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the glass facade of the hotel. The city seemed brighter after the storm. As Margaret prepared to leave, dozens of employees gathered near the entrance. Not because they had been instructed to, because they wanted to. Victoria stood beside the revolving doors. Ethan stood nearby as well. Margaret carried the wooden box beneath one arm, while her old suitcase rolled quietly behind her. Before stepping outside, she turned one final time. The lobby looked different now. Not because the building had changed, because the people inside it had. Victoria embraced her gently. Ethan shook her hand. His eyes reflected gratitude rather than embarrassment. Margaret smiled at both of them. Then she stepped into the morning sunlight. The city welcomed her with a cool breeze and the distant sound of traffic. She walked slowly down the sidewalk, her suitcase wheels humming softly against the pavement. Behind her, through the towering glass windows, Victoria and Ethan watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The lesson had already been learned. Kindness had outlived time. Dignity had outlasted judgment. And somewhere high above the city, sunlight touched the bronze plaque in the room of first beginnings, illuminating a name that would continue reminding future generations that the smallest act of respect can change a life. While the quiet footsteps of Margaret Hayes faded into the morning, leaving behind something far greater than recognition. She left behind a legacy of grace.